If you like audiobooks or audio shows, check out a free trial of Audible. Just click the link in the description. Welcome to Mindshock True Crime. This is your host, Bruce McGuire, and you are listening to the Brandon Lawson series. This is episode 1, A Texas Mystery. And the Brandon Lawson case, one of the most popular true crime cases online, hasn't quite been covered in the mainstream media quite as extensively as some other cases, but we have a 911 call, we have a lot of different theories revolving around drug activity, corrupt law enforcement, and state troopers, of course. I mean, again, there's a reason certain cases are solved and certain cases are unsolved. And it never ceases to amaze me how many so-called true crime aficionados do not spend time specifically studying which cases had police corruption and which cases did not. Now, I'm not saying there's police corruption here. There could just be fallibility on the side of humans, what a shocker, and people's egos preventing that fallibility from being exposed. Just classic human psychology, not really all that mind-shocking, yet it causes certain coincidence theorists to just go bonkers and get triggered and start calling people thinking critically conspiracy theorists. You see this in a lot of true crime cases. But we will be examining this case in typical Mindshock fashion with logic and reason at the forefront, remaining objective, logical, and neutral in this scientific examination of the Brandon Lawson case, officially unsolved. As always, if you enjoy the podcast, you can donate to our PayPal. Just check the link in the description. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit that bell for notifications, or you can just go to youtube.com/Mindshock or youtube.com/MindshockTrueCrime. To keep awareness up in this case and other cases, hit that like button, share the podcast across social media platforms, of which you can find us on Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, and Patreon. Patrons do get priority for case topic logical analysis co-podcaster requests. You could also be a guest on the podcast depending on your tier. All right, so let's do the quick overview. And information has come out over the years. There have been a few updates here and there. But there's a certain shroud of mystery around the case that we will be attempting to cut through to find the truth here. So just from the wiki, August 8th, 2013, Brandon Lawson of San Angelo, Texas, disappeared after leaving his home earlier that night. Brandon Lawson arrived at his home in San Angelo, Texas, where he lived with his girlfriend of 10 years, Ladessa Lofton. Between approximately 10:45 and 11 p.m., Brandon and Ladessa argued. Brandon had not returned home the night before, and Ladessa believed that Brandon was on drugs at the time. At the time, Brandon had ongoing issues with substance abuse, but had been clean for about 6 months. Brandon's brother, Kyle Lawson, later claimed that Brandon had taken methamphetamines shortly before his disappearance. Around 11:30 p.m., Brandon called his father in Crowley, Texas, about a 3-hour drive from San Angelo, and told him he was coming to his house. At 11:54 p.m., Brandon left his house to go to his father's house, driving his silver Ford F-150. At about 12:30 a.m. on August 9th, Brandon called Kyle and told him he had run out of gas and was pulled over on U.S. Route 277 between San Angelo and Bronte, Texas. Kyle claimed that during the call, Brandon told him that 3 expletives are chasing me out of town, and later clarified it was the Mexicans in the neighborhood. Kyle asked if he was hallucinating, which Brandon denied. Do hallucinating people know they're hallucinating, though? Kyle, along with his wife and 4-year-old child, drove to Ladessa's house and retrieved a gas can. Kyle said they continued to make calls to each other, but Brandon wouldn't hold a conversation with him, usually ending the call after a few sentences. And we will be examining exactly what that means. So there's ongoing calls here, but they're all really, really short. And Brandon's the one who just, again, couple sentences, and the call. And they did that apparently multiple times, according to Kyle. And is that unusual in a missing persons case? Because I do not recall a case quite like this one. At 12:50 a.m., Brandon called 911, which rang at a local nursing home in Robert Lee, Texas. And he told the responder that he had run out of gas and he needed the police. The 911 call rang at a local nursing home. Is that where they operate a dispatch at them? During the call, Lawson made several confused or incoherent statements, including, "Yes, I'm in the middle of a field." And then there's some speculation on this word or phrase here. Something pulled some guys over. And we'll be examining what that word is. Some people believe it's state troopers pulled some guys over, which lead down rabbit holes of law enforcement conspiracies. Anyway, so yes, I'm in the middle of a field. Something pulled some guys over right here going towards Abilene on both sides. My truck ran out of gas. There's no one. There's one car here. There's guys chasing, again, something into the woods. Please hurry. Several minutes later, 12:56 a.m., a trucker called 911 to report Lawson's truck, which was parked in a hazardous manner on the road. Between 12:50 a.m. and 1:15 a.m., Brandon received and made several calls with his brother, his girlfriend, his neighbor, and the 911 dispatcher, though his poor cell phone reception caused several of these calls to go straight to voicemail, and after 1:19 a.m., all calls to his phone went straight to voicemail. At around 1:18 a.m., Kyle called Brandon, who sounded out of breath and claimed he was bleeding. Shortly after 1 a.m., a sheriff's deputy arrived at Lawson's truck, though Lawson wasn't there. Kyle arrived at the truck around 1:10 a.m. 1:10 a.m. At the time, he was on the phone with Brandon, who told him, "I can see you. I'm right here." But neither the deputy nor Kyle could see Brandon. And how creepy is that? So Kyle's at the truck at 1:10 a.m. on the phone with Brandon Lawson, who's telling him, "I can see you. I'm right here." But neither the deputy nor Kyle could see Brandon. Is this like any other missing persons case ever? No, it is not. And it really does need some logical, comprehensive examination. At the time of the disappearance, Brandon had an active arrest warrant on him, and Kyle thought that he may have been hiding from the deputy. After talking to the officer, Kyle drove a short distance up the road and parked the car to wait for Brandon to appear, though after about 30 to 45 minutes, he left. Kyle left the gas can in the back of Brandon's truck and later returned to the truck at 5 a.m., where he was surprised that Brandon had not returned. Around 8 a.m., the truck was towed. So let's go over this scenario again. So Kyle believes Brandon is there looking at him a ways off through the trees. And so he drives a short distance up the road. So short distance, what can we assume that to be? A short distance. Why wouldn't Brandon appear at that moment? Because he's no longer with the deputy. Or is he that scared? Or is there something going on that we don't know about, as is usually the case in unsolved cases? In the aftermath of the disappearance, a local deputy organized a search party and spent several hours investigating the area near Lawson's truck, but found no signs of Lawson. Friends and family of Lawson set up a Facebook page called Help Find Brandon Lawson, which as of 2016 had over 12,000 likes. However, Lawson remains missing. And, okay. So, a lot of issues here. Very, very unique case, of course. A lot of things that don't make sense. And before we go further down these avenues of exploration, I just want to touch on something I've touched upon in other cases. For whatever reason, a certain percentage of the populace says, oh, well, this individual was on drugs. Therefore, they just wandered somewhere, happened to die, accident, and nobody ever found them. Nothing to see here. All the searchers are incompetent. Everybody's always incompetent. And it was just a case of drug use. That's all there is to see. And this kind of silly Dunning-Kruger nonsense was really bizarre because someone who's on drugs and maybe not 100% in their right mind, if that was the case here, maybe he was, maybe he wasn't, but even if he was, does that make it more or less likely that he could be met with foul play? Same thing we see in the Lisa Lam case, Emma Filipoff. There's a lot of cases where, for whatever reason, there are certain clueless goofballs out there that don't realize if you're on drugs out of your mind, if that's true. Again, we don't know if it is or it isn't, if you weren't there. If that's true, does that make someone more or less of a target? Again, this isn't rocket science. Obviously, predators out there, or shady individuals, people involved in drugs, crime, whatever, would they be more emboldened or more likely to act on someone who is a druggie and who is under the influence and might not be able to fight back, might not know where they are? They might assume, might not have as much friends or family to look for them. Who knows what the case may be? But it's just weird how a certain percentage of people hallucinate that people on drugs magically are marked and protected from foul play under any circumstances. Magically protected from any and all individuals that might do them harm. It's just really bizarre. A lot of clueless goofs out there. So let's continue here. I'm going to go over this pretty comprehensive write-up by Jordan Windnagel on thoughtcatalog.com, The Chilling Disappearance of Brandon Lawson. Brandon Lawson was 26 years old when he went missing on August 9th, 2013. It's a puzzling case for many reasons. Not only was Brandon in contact with his brother Kyle moments before he disappeared, but they were also in the same area, possibly yards apart. And that's, of course, quite heartbreaking. The basics are this. Brandon was in a fight with his long-term girlfriend, Ladessa, and left their home. His truck ran out of gas. He asked his brother to bring a gas can. When Kyle got there, Brandon was not in the vehicle. They spoke on the phone, and a police officer pulled up behind Brandon's truck. Brandon said to Kyle, "One time, run." According to Kyle, this means law enforcement run. Brandon was close enough to observe what was happening at his truck, but no one at the scene ever saw him. When Kyle refused to run from the cop, Brandon hung up on him. This detail makes the case even more confusing because Brandon himself called 911 before Kyle's arrival. You can listen to the 911 recording here, and this is what we will do now. And however, if there is, so whether he's on drugs or not, let's say he is, so he's extra confused. If there were state troopers that pulled someone over and there was some kind of situation, he might have thought this particular law enforcement officer was part of the corrupt law enforcement. So even though he called 911, either under the influence or not, there might have been some confusion on his part on which law enforcement officers were involved in which situation. And again, that's something that might not get discussed as much as it should. So let's go over the call.
911 emergency.
Yes, I'm in the middle of the field. It's like we're just pushing guys over. Right here going towards Javelin on both sides. My truck ran out of gas. There's one car here and got shaken to the woods. Please hurry.
Okay, now run that by me. One more.
I'm not talking to him. I actually ran into him.
Ah, you ran into him. Okay.
Got the first guy.
Do you need an ambulance?
Yeah, no, I need the cops.
Okay. Is anybody hurt? Hello? 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 Ah, you ran into him. Okay.
Got the first guy.
Do you need an ambulance? Ah, you ran into him. Okay.
Got the first guy.
Do you need an ambulance? Ah, you ran into him. Okay.
Got the first guy.
Do you need an ambulance? Ah, you ran into him. Okay.
Got the first guy.
Do you need an ambulance?
So let's dissect this. Is it possible, if there is some kind of law enforcement cover-up, that this 911 call was edited? Because if you listen to the beginning of the call, it does sound like something was clipped out. Now imagine him saying state trooper just pulled some guys over.
Yes, I'm in the middle of the field. The tape was just pushing guys over. Tape was just pushing guys over. Tape was just pushing guys over. Tape was just pushing guys over.
If this was clipped, you wouldn't be able to tell state troopers. Or maybe it wasn't intentionally edited. Maybe the recording glitched. As they sometimes do. It's a cell phone. If the reception wasn't 100% perfect, it's possible there was a fraction of a second cut or half a second cut on state trooper just pulled some guys over. Let's listen to it again.
911 emergency.
Yes, I'm in the middle of the field. The tape was just pushing guys over.
It sounds like staper, not sniper, staper. State trooper? Staper? It does, I don't hear a glitch, a deleted glitch, which, I mean, it's still possible, I guess, but it seems it might be more likely that this was professionally edited so that there's no pause in the word and that it'd be difficult to figure it out, because how often are people talking about it might be a state trooper? So, again, people involved in a conspiracy or a cover-up, they wouldn't necessarily be the greatest geniuses in all of history. So we don't know what they were thinking, how they were thinking, particularly if there's other variables involved. So if the call was edited, what could that mean, state trooper? Or again, if the call was not edited, regardless of whether there is or isn't corruption, if Brandon Lawson was either freaked out, adrenaline spiked, or on drugs, would he run the words together to the point where in his head it's making sense, but his mouth and tongue are just not making the right words? So he meant to say state trooper, but he's very agitated, so he just ran it together. Staper, staper, state trooper, staper, state trooper, staper. I don't know. Furthermore, if you listen, there's a second person. It sounds like someone is saying protect yourself in the background. So here's a call edited to remove the 911 operator and enhance some of the audio here. We can see a bunch of gunshots.
Right here going towards Javelin on both sides. My truck ran out of gas. There's one car here. Got chasing to the woods. Please hurry.
Okay, now run that by me.
One more. Not talking to him. I actually ran into him.
Ah, you ran into him. Okay.
Got the first guy.
Do you need an ambulance?
Yeah, no, I need the cops.
Okay. Is anybody hurt? Hello? 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 Ah, you ran into him. Okay.
Got the first guy.
Do you need an ambulance? Ah, you ran into him. Okay.
Got the first guy.
Do you need an ambulance? Ah, you ran into him. Okay.
Got the first guy.
Do you need an ambulance? Ah, you ran into him. Okay.
Got the first guy.
Do you need an ambulance? Hello?
It sounds like someone in the background saying protect yourself, and then there's also a bunch of gunshots. And if this call was edited, it might be out of order too, because when they ask, do you need an ambulance? He says, yeah. Then he says, no. It almost sounds like his tone is different. It sounds like that could have been taken from a different part of the call. Let's listen again. Let's listen to this cleaned up version.
Yes, I'm in the middle of the field. It's like we're just pushing guys over. Right here going towards Javelin on both sides. My truck ran out of gas. There's one car here. You got to take the to the woods. Quick flirting. And when I talking to him, I show you an home. That's the first guy.
You need an ambulance?
Yeah. No, I need the cops.
So was this type of situation where there's some state troopers? Maybe they're not. Maybe they weren't necessarily corrupt. Maybe not. There was some kind of drug activity going on. If they were innocent at that moment and something went down, did they think someone had a gun that didn't? They shot someone. Brandon Lawson happened to be there. Then they left or went chasing these other people, and they realized they shot somebody that wasn't armed. What was the situation there? And is this 911 call heavily edited? And for the people who believe there was no editing at all, it's just difficult to explain these things, the change in tonality, the second individual, I don't know, it's really, really tough. But let's continue here with the Thought Catalog article. Why did Brandon call for help and then tell Kyle to run from the officer? What is he trying to explain to the emergency dispatcher, and what events led up to this night? The phone call with Kyle would be the last time anyone ever spoke to Brandon Lawson. It's been over 7 years, and his disappearance remains unsolved. Another point here is during that 911 call, did the officers not act in a particular way that traumatized Brandon Lawson? I mean, who knows what was going down at the moment of the call, and then if these are really gunshots audible in the call, is that the state troopers shooting people? And then after that, when he's on the phone with Kyle, he's saying run from the officer because of what had happened during the 911 call. And at that moment, he no longer trusts the police, whereas when he was making the 911 call, he did trust the police. Is that a possible explanation? Here's the timeline of events. August 8th, 2013, approximately 10:45 to 11 p.m., Brandon and Ledessa argued. In the Missing Maura Murray podcast, Ledessa says the argument started because she believed Brandon was on drugs. She told him to get out. Kyle later confirms that Brandon had done methamphetamines prior to his disappearance. Brandon had ongoing issues with substance abuse and had previously been clean for 6 months. 11:54 p.m., Brandon leaves his house in San Angelo, Texas. It's believed he was heading to his dad's house near Fort Worth, Texas. August 9th, 2013, approximately 12:30 a.m., Brandon calls Kyle to say he ran out of gas while driving on US 277 toward Bronte, Texas. Kyle, with his girlfriend and son in the car, head over to Ledessa's because they need to pick up a gas can. 12:50 a.m., Brandon calls 911. 12:58 a.m., a passing truck driver calls 911 to report Brandon's abandoned truck on the side of the highway. The vehicle was parked in a hazardous manner with its tail end hanging over the white line. 1:18 a.m., Kyle calls Brandon to find his exact location. Brandon sounded out of breath, like he was running, and claimed he was bleeding. He told them to hurry before hanging up. Approximately 1:30 a.m., Kyle arrives at Brandon's truck, but he's not in the vehicle. While on the phone with Brandon, a police officer pulls up to the scene. Brandon says one time, "Run," to Kyle, to which Kyle responded that he wasn't going to run. Brandon said, "Where is your pride, mother," expletive, then hung up. That's another little detail that's usually not mentioned in other write-ups. Where is your pride, mother, expletive? And then he hung up after that. So, yes, so his mental state, there's a certain amount of wherewithal there. He's not so spaced out that he can't operate a phone and he can't explain what's going on. He said, and apparently he also saw him there with the officer and he's not far away. Is he going out in and out of some kind of mental state where he's traumatized by whatever happened with the officers? Did he get into a car accident with the state trooper? Or did another party pull up on him, other drug dealers, whatever? Was it a case of mistaken identity? Or was he involved in other drug dealers and they were after him? And police intersected that in some capacity, either corrupt, crooked police or not. Or not. Again, this is Mindshock. The only thing we know for sure is that we don't know anything for sure. So if you weren't there that night, you don't really know. So no need to get triggered by people going through possible theories. Most of the cases that become these highly talked about cases online that are as of yet unsolved, there might be missing unusual outlier variables in these cases, like possibly corrupt law enforcement, or people impersonating law enforcement, or CIs, all these things that coincidence theorists scoff at in their Dunning-Kruger stupors. These are the outlier cases. So that might be true in this case. Nobody's saying it's true across 90+% of all these other cases that are actually solved. So it's very interesting to see the psychological response from cognitive dissonant coincidence theorists whenever someone brings up a theory that there might be corrupt law enforcement involved. It's very telling. Some of these authority-worshipping cultists can't stand the very notion that it might be possible that there's law enforcement officers out there that are fallible and or corrupt. It's really weird. You see it in a lot of cases. So let's continue here. Approximately 1:30 to 4:30 a.m. The details are a little unclear during this time, but Kyle says that he drove up and down the highway looking for Brandon. At some point, he had to leave to get his son food. Afterward, he returned to search, possibly with friends. And it's weird, even in 2020, these details are unclear, whether he had friends or not to search. And again, what is the story with Kyle? Does he know a lot more than he has said? Was there some kind of hit put out on Brandon? And did it involve corrupt law enforcement? And did Kyle know about some of this, but not the corrupt law enforcement aspect of it? Approximately 4 a.m., Ledessa woke up and noticed multiple missed calls from Kyle, Brandon, and Brandon's mom. Her phone had been in her van because her only charger at the time was a car charger. Ledessa tries to call Brandon back, but his phone continuously rings. She assumes he doesn't have service. She eventually speaks to Kyle, and he tells her that he's at the truck, but they haven't been able to find Brandon. 7 a.m., Kyle puts gas in Brandon's truck and leaves. Approximately 8:30 to 9 a.m., the sheriff's department has Brandon's truck towed. So apparently it's parked in a hazardous manner. The other thing that kind of strikes out at me is, what if he had filled Brandon's truck with the gas right away and just left? Because if Brandon was still around, would he have entered the truck and then drove to his father's house? What else was going on that night? That seems to be that there's missing variables here that we need to know. And other important details from this Thought Catalog article: Brandon had an outstanding warrant. Kyle believed this to be the reason that Brandon was hiding from the officer at the scene. He didn't know that Brandon had called 911, and he didn't realize how serious the situation was at the time. When Brandon told Kyle he was bleeding, Kyle assumed he had tripped or run into a cactus. I guess that's a common issue in Texas. Brandon never told him of an attack or anyone else present that night. Brandon had been experiencing paranoia that day. He told Kyle that Ledessa, quote, had people from their neighborhood after him, end quote. Ledessa doesn't know why Brandon said that, and Kyle is adamant that Brandon was simply being paranoid. Now, you know what's interesting there? How many times have so-called paranoid delusions have simply been awareness episodes? Now, there's a couple different possibilities here. Perhaps there were people from the neighborhood after them, and Ledessa didn't send them, but because they were fighting, Brandon thought that Ledessa did. So there could have really been people after him, but not sent by Ledessa. Or, of course, that could be true. Maybe they were sent by Ledessa. Again, I don't know any of these people. I wasn't there. I am not saying this is likely in any way. I'm saying I don't know if it's true. How can anyone verify this? And it probably can be verified. So the people that know Ledessa, if they checked everybody out in the neighborhood and they can verify that it was nobody from the neighborhood, perhaps he said neighborhood again because he's on drugs, and he didn't really mean their neighborhood. He meant some other neighborhood, but his brain is foggy. Either way, it's possible he wasn't being paranoid, because if there are some people after him, not from the neighborhood, even though he might have said neighborhood. Again, not everybody speaks perfectly clearly, especially when on drugs. Even when not on drugs, people that are scared or agitated, they don't always say everything with 100% accuracy if they're in an emotional state. So it's very possible people were after him either from his neighborhood or not from his neighborhood. Law enforcement initially suspected that Kyle was involved either by helping Brandon run away or due to foul play. Kyle agreed to take a polygraph. He's been administered to and passed. And again, I've constantly spoke about brain fingerprint scanning, far superior to any polygraph test. Now, it's interesting that law enforcement suspected Kyle was involved. And it's weird. He's going up and down the highway searching for him. But if he was really involved, wouldn't he not be doing? Or do they believe at a certain point he found him and helped him get away? Or if law enforcement are involved in a cover-up, of course they're going to focus on someone like Kyle to take attention away from themselves. The area where Brandon disappeared has been searched many times, both on foot and from a bird's eye view. Thermal imaging cameras, plane searches, and cadaver dogs were all used in the days after a PI hired by the Lawsons also searched via helicopter. Sounds like a very thorough search. The terrain in the area where Brandon disappeared is extremely rough. It's known to be inhabited by wild hogs and rattlesnakes. This is Brandon's last known location. He was right next to the Colorado River, which was experiencing severe droughts at the time. The river was said to be knee-deep at its highest. Some listeners of the 911 call believe that they can hear gunshots in the background. Kyle says that's the noise of cars driving on the bridge over the Colorado River. Interesting. And it would be interesting if they did any reenactments where they recorded phone calls in that location to see, because if it's an uneven bridge and there's some kind of bumps and those are the gunshots, I don't know. He'd have to be really close to the highway, would he not? And why was there no rougher engine noise or truck noise or something? And how there's that many cars going over that bridge that late in the early morning? I don't know. It's weird. And there's Kickapoo Creek nearby too. Kickapoo High School, of course, where two of the Springfield 3 had graduated from, the Springfield 3 case. If you haven't checked that out, check that out. Mindshock covers that as well. Just thought it's kind of strange. There's a Kickapoo Creek right by the Colorado River, not far from where Brandon Lawson was last known to be. And yeah, there's a lot of fields in the area. There are people's properties around as well. It is strange. What can you say? It is very strange. Some people apparently have done some research, and I have not verified this to be true, but apparently that location, there's a local police officer who has property there. And there were property owners who also refused to allow their land to be searched. I believe at least one property owner refused to have their land searched. What that all means, I don't know. That's the last known location of a missing person. Landowners refusing a search. Also, this county is Coke County. You can't make this stuff up. So he was right. Okay. According to this San Angelo News article, Brandon withdrew his 401k before his disappearance. This is confirmed by Ledessa in the article, though she's unaware whether he received the money. His last paycheck was direct deposited on the night he went missing, and Brandon never withdrew that money. So what does that mean? And I'll go over that article in a moment as soon as I'm done with this one. None of Brandon's items, such as his phone, keys, or wallet, have ever been recovered. After helicopter searches, the Coke County Sheriff asserts that there was no sign of a struggle. One spot underneath a tree appeared to have indentation marks. The sheriff said it's possible this is where Brandon crouched to watch Kyle and the officer at his truck. So what happened to Brandon Lawson? Deputy Neal of the Coke County Sheriff's Office thinks he walked back to the highway and got a ride. Law enforcement unanimously reports that foul play was not a factor and believes a body would have been found if Brandon was still in Coke County. But how do they know he wasn't taken elsewhere and foul play was there? But the Lawsons assert that Brandon never would have left his family, and Kyle denies he was hallucinating from drugs. Many feel that the 911 call points to foul play. Others hear the recording as a sign of drug-induced mania and believed Brandon succumbed to the elements. Now, let's say it is drug-induced mania. How does that mean there wasn't also a situation with either corrupt law enforcement or criminals of some kind? I mean, again, these black and white logical fallacies are so obvious small children can understand them, and yet so many other pieces just want to desperately misapply Occam's razor when there's so many variables missing. There's no shortage of conspiracy theories claiming abduction by drug cartels or the trucker who called 911 or police cover-ups, and the list goes on and on. Because we all know that has never happened in any case ever, right? We can only hope that this case is solved someday. Until then, we can't help but wonder how a 26-year-old father of four seemingly vanished into thin air. So I will go over this article from San Angelo, which is very in-depth, by Krista Johnson. This was posted July 12, 2018, updated August 9, 2019. Every few months, Coke County's 6-person sheriff's office, that's not a big office, receives a call from someone seeking information about Brandon Lawson. Every few months, they tell someone the case is dead. That's an interesting way to put it. However, this is interesting. They only have a 6-person office. So if 1 or 2 or 3 of these individuals was involved in some law enforcement cover-up, that would be even easier to keep quiet because there's not a gigantic department. Yeah, it's very interesting. We don't have any leads, Chief Deputy Brandon Neal explains. We have nothing. How often do law enforcement admit that flat out? That is blunt. Let me say that again. We don't have any leads, Chief Deputy Brandon Neal explains. We have nothing. On Thursday, August 8th, 2013, Lawson, then 26, briefly returned to his San Angelo home after not coming home the previous night. Ledessa Lofton, Lawson's girlfriend of 10 years, mother of their 3 children, and stepmom to Lawson's eldest daughter, was infuriated by his absence because of his recent drug relapse. The two fought and he left. Lawson never returned. His last known location was along U.S. Highway 277, north of San Angelo and right before the West Texas town of Bronte, population not quite 1,000. A desolate 2-lane highway. Deputy Neal said a person could probably lie down in the middle of the road and not worry about being run over? Wait a second here. If it's that desolate, so we hear multiple things that could be gunshots, like 3, 4, or 5 gunshots, 4 or 5. And Kyle said it was cars going over the highway at 1 a.m., whereas Deputy Neal is saying that it's desolate and you could lie down in the middle of the road and not worry about being run over. And he didn't even say that in the middle of the night. He's making that statement in general. Can you do that during the day? So how could there be that many vehicles? And later on in the audio, there's 3 gunshots in relative succession. Could that be 3 vehicles if it's that desolate? I don't know. Those are things to think about. Was it gunshots or cars going over a highway, as Kyle for some reason has said? And how would he know? That's kind of weird. A red and white metal cross standing about 3 feet tall marks the spot where Brandon's pickup rolled to a stop that night. Even if you're looking for it, you might miss it among the overgrown brush and cactus that line the terrain. Is it cactus or cacti? I don't know. Some people think Lawson, because of an outstanding warrant or his rocky relationship with Lofton, purposely disappeared and is living a new life undetected. I mean, how would that explain the anomalies in the call, though, and someone in the background saying, protect yourself? Some think Lawson, because of a 911 call he made that night and the fact neither his remains nor possessions have been found, was hurt by someone. And some think Lawson, because of his drug use and the rough terrain in the area, died from the elements out there in the scrub, and search attempts just haven't found him. The night of Brandon Lawson's disappearance, according to a phone call he had with his father around 11:30 that night, Brandon was headed to his parents' house in Crowley, about 3 hours away. It was just past 12:30 a.m. when he called his brother, Kyle Lawson, who also lived in San Angelo, asking for help because he ran out of gas. 3 expletives are chasing me out of town, Brandon told his brother. When Brandon said it was the Mexicans in the neighborhood, Kyle asked if he was tripping, if it was drugs causing him to hallucinate, but Brandon denied it was all in his head. Kyle went over to Brandon and Lofton's house less than a mile away to get the gas can, then headed out of town with his wife at the time and 4-year-old son. The brothers kept making calls to one another, but Kyle said Brandon wouldn't have a full conversation with him, more or less saying a sentence or 2 before hanging up. At one point, Brandon said he was running through a field and was bleeding, which Kyle took as him tripping over some rocks or another minor accident of the sort. At 12:50 a.m., Brandon called 911, which at the time rang at the local nursing home in Robert Lee. The call is hard to understand, but many have said Brandon sounded distressed. Among a series of unclear statements, he told the dispatcher he ran out of gas, was in the middle of a field, and that he needed help, and asked, "Please hurry." When the dispatcher asked if Brandon needed an ambulance, he said, "No, I need the cops." Although that's not entirely true. You could hear him say, "Yeah," and then in a different tone, "No, I need the cops." Possibly from a different part of the conversation if the call was edited. Spotty's cell phone service kept several calls to and from Brandon Lawson from connecting. Here's a look at those phone records. 12:51, Kyle called Brandon and left a voicemail. 12:51, Brandon called Lofton, but she didn't answer. After their fight and lacking a wall charger, Lofton had taken her phone to her car to charge. And another point here, if Brandon Lawson really is that tripped out on drugs, he seems to be able to operate his phone quite efficiently and make all of these quick calls to a bunch of different people. You have to navigate the phone menu to call all these different people. And if he's just calling random individuals, that's not the case. He's calling these same few individuals, so it's not just him hitting whatever on his phone. So clearly there's a certain amount of wherewithal. And you could hear that also on the call. He seems pretty lucid. He does not seem like he's completely out of it on some drug trip. And it's not difficult to make these calls that quickly. And it's difficult to make calls very, very quickly if you're completely out of it and you can barely read your screen or whatever the case may be. 12:52, Kyle's wife called Brandon, then called again. 12:54, Kyle called Brandon. 12:57, Brandon called his neighbor. 12:58, Brandon called Kyle and called again. 12:58, the neighbor called 3 times. 12:59, Kyle called Brandon. 1:04, the dispatcher at the nursing facility called Brandon back, trying to get more information about his location and what was wrong. She left a voicemail and called once more. 1:09, Brandon called Kyle 3 times. 1:12, Kyle called Brandon 3 times. 1:15, Brandon called Kyle twice, the last calls he made from his phone. 1:19, all calls made to his phone begin going straight to voicemail. Deputy Neal arrived at Brandon's pickup just after 1 a.m. after dispatch received a 911 call from a trucker along US 277 that reported Brandon's F-150 obstructing traffic by being over the white line. The last gas station before Bronte is in San Angelo, a distance of about 30 miles between another, so Neal had responded to plenty of calls of people running out of gas. When he arrived at Brandon's pickup, Brandon wasn't there, but Kyle was just pulling up. "I can see you, I'm right here," Kyle said Brandon told him, although he couldn't see his brother anywhere. With an active warrant out of Johnson County for possession with intent to deliver, Kyle assumed Brandon was hiding to avoid getting in trouble with the police. So again, for all the coincidence theorists out there, this is a guy who has a warrant out for possession with intent to deliver. So what kind of individuals, what kind of circles is Brandon Lawson running with? And is it really out of the realm of possibility that other drug dealers or drug-related criminals were out to get him for whatever reason? And that may or may not include corrupt law enforcement or state troopers. "I hollered and screamed my brother's name and he never came out," Kyle Lawson said. At the time, neither Neal nor Kyle knew about the 911 call Brandon had made. Kyle told Neal the pickup belonged to Brandon and that he was walking along the road, but his phone kept losing reception, purposely leaving out the fact Brandon said he was close by. "At the time, I didn't feel he was in any danger," Kyle said. After Kyle and Neal finished talking, Kyle decided to drive away and park up the road a bit to see if his brother would come out once the deputy left. "I sat there for a good 30 to 45 minutes, Kyle said. He eventually left because his son was hungry and crying. He wasn't able to put gas in the can because his check hadn't hit his bank account yet, so he left it in the bed of the pickup thinking Brandon would be able to walk to the gas station. I go back to San Angelo, I get food for my kid and stuff. I figure, okay, he's just out there, he's hiding because of the police. He's going to be out there whenever I go back. When I take the gas, maybe the police officer will be gone by then," Kyle said. When he did get back to the pickup about 5 a.m., Brandon wasn't anywhere to be found. "I hollered and screamed my brother's name, and he never came out." Is Brandon Lawson missing on purpose? One working theory is Brandon Lawson's criminal past and rocky relationship pushed him to voluntarily disappear and start a new life. Because the pickup was over the white line and Brandon was the only one with a key, Coke County had it towed a little after 8 a.m., August 9th, 2013. The next day, according to a sheriff's report, Deputy Neal checked the homes and properties of owners who were gone because many people in the area use their land seasonally, looking to see if anything had been disturbed or for signs someone might have gotten water from them. He didn't find anything. Later that day, he checked the same area with a thermal imaging camera but didn't register a human-sized heat signature. On August 11th, Neal reported a small private search team gathered at 8 a.m. and ended their search about noon. So regarding the thermal imaging camera, now again, this is something I go over in the Delphi case. So in the Delphi case, the thermal imaging drone camera did not pick up any bodies, which leads many to believe that Liberty German and Abigail Williams were not there the day of the disappearance, and they were brought back at a later time, and they were discovered. Also because people, allegedly multiple searchers, searched the exact area where they were found, and they weren't there until the following day. Regarding the thermal imaging camera here, if Brandon Lawson, let's say, just passed out and was still alive, then the next day, his heat signature would still be there if he was still alive, or if he had died not long before, because the human body does retain heat for quite some time. So it seems like he wasn't in the area unless he went beyond the area that the thermal imaging camera searched. On August 11th, Neil reported a small private search team gathered at 8 a.m. and ended their search about noon. The only sign of anyone being in the area was a spot under a tree where it appeared someone sat down close to the roadway within eyesight of where Lawson's pickup broke down, the report states. Texas Ranger Lieutenant Dwayne Gall met with Neil and Coke County Sheriff Wayne McCutcheon about the case August 12th. Neil reported Gall came to the same conclusion as he and McCutcheon, that Lawson is possibly no longer in Coke County, but would see about making arrangements on the availability of a DPS helicopter. Lofton came to the sheriff's office to officially file a missing persons report Tuesday, August 13th. That's a lot of days later. The same day, Texas Ranger Nick Hanna, who now leads the case, came to Coke. Is that suspicious? That Lofton or Kyle did not officially file a missing persons report until August 13th. I mean, that's close to a week later. The same day, Texas Ranger Nick Hanna, who now leads the case, came to Coke County to take a helicopter ride over the area from the Colorado River south and along both sides of US 277 near where Brandon's pickup was. It was determined that Lawson was not on the ground due to the fact there was a lot of exposed bare ground, even under the short mesquite and cedar bushes, Neil wrote. His report is concluded in his opinion that Brandon Lawson is not in Coke County, lost or hiding. Interesting. The opinion is based on Kyle's revelation that Brandon was hiding in the brush near his pickup to avoid being discovered by Neil, not seeing any indication of foul play in or around the pickup, and the text messages between Brandon and Lofton detailing the severity of their fight that night. You know what's weird, though? Yes, let's say they had the most severe fight ever. If Brandon Lawson is involved with drug criminals, that fight is almost irrelevant, because if there's drug criminals out to get him, whether he fights with his girlfriend or not, if they're out to get him, they're out to get him. It's kind of weird. His belief, he reported, is that after he and Kyle left the pickup, Lawson walked back to the roadway and was able to get a ride from a passing motorist. And yet he's saying you can lay on the road and not worry about being run over. So how long did it take him to get? Not every motorist might be willing to give a random guy a ride. I don't know. Years later, Brandon's continued absence has strengthened Neil's views. When he went missing, Coke County was in the middle of a bad drought, Neil said. During a plane search, Neil said they were able to spot corn sacks from the air. If you can see those from the plane, you can see someone laying down, he said. At the time, the drought was bad. Leaves were drying up and everything, he said, adding that the river at that time was low, the deepest point just reaching his knee. If someone wants to be gone, they can, Neil said, adding Brandon had an active warrant, which could be a contributing factor for why he is gone. In addition to the warrant, those who have followed the case also point to the fact that Brandon cashed in his 401k with Renegade Oil Services just before he went missing. Several months after Brandon's disappearance, Kyle Lawson was asked to meet Ranger Hanna, Sheriff McCutcheon, and an investigator from Johnson County, where Brandon's warrant was issued, to answer questions. They asked Kyle whether he had hurt his brother or given him a ride somewhere. Kyle eventually requested a polygraph test. So Kyle was the one requesting the polygraph. I guess he got annoyed at their questions. They said I passed the one on harming and tried to say the first one was faulty because I had coughed a few times during the test, Kyle said. Wow, that's really weird though. So they were really focused on Kyle. Huh. Interesting. Another man, John Shadden, disappeared from Coke County in 2007 and has never been seen again. Neil said his disappearance was intentional too, a sentiment shared by some of Shadden's acquaintances, but a sentiment Lawson's family staunchly denies as a possibility for Brandon. And that's kind of weird too, though. Is Neil's default position is, oh, these people just ran away intentionally, that way he doesn't actually have to solve a case? Because if this is just being repeated for everybody that disappears from Cook County, oh, this is bizarre. This is bizarre. Quite mind-shocking. Was Brandon Lawson harmed? During calls before he went missing, Brandon said he was being chased and requested police during his 911 call. Some believe that as evidence, someone killed Brandon after he left his pickup. Brandon's father, Brad Lawson, goes back and forth on what he thinks happened to his son. Sometimes he tries to be realistic, saying that he accepts the chances of Brandon being alive are slim. Other times he admits to nightmares, like seeing Brandon being forced into slave labor for a cartel, one of the few situations he can think of that would mean Brandon is alive. If Brandon were intentionally harmed by someone, there are endless ways it could have occurred. The Lawson family has wondered whether someone was actually following him that night, whether he stumbled on someone's land and never left, whether his death was a crime of opportunity for someone passing. I'm so scared we're never going to find him, Lofton said. My kids are going to be having their own kids or getting married and still not know what happened to their dad or where he's at. The couple met in high school during her sophomore year, his junior. When he approached her in the hallway asking if she knew who he was, she proudly responded, "No, am I supposed to?" even though she had seen him around. He asked her to write her phone number down on a piece of paper. I swear there was already a number there, she chuckled, but decided to give it to him anyway. His laugh, his personality, and his pretty blue eyes caught and kept her attention for the next 10 years. Being with family was important to them, and they enjoyed doing things together like watching movies, going camping and fishing, living life to the fullest, Lofton said. We weren't the perfect couple. We grew up together. We were babies, but we were happy. We loved each other. Their fight that night, she said, was the result of several factors. We were stressed out, she said, explaining he was working over 60 hours a week and they had 3 kids in the house. Their youngest son only a few months old at the time. So he's working over 60 hours a week. So how much of a dysfunctional druggie could he be working that many hours? For a long time, I blamed myself, she said. She also regrets the words spoken during their fight. I will never get those words back. For her and their children, the 911 call contains the last words they have from Brandon. The 2 older girls listened to it on YouTube, trying to make sense of what he was saying. It just hurts me that I can't find him for them, she said. As a mother, you don't ever want your children to go through pain. Brad doesn't believe his son deserted his family. Something happened that night, and it wasn't him meeting a girl and driving off somewhere, Brad said. In his opinion, the warrant definitely wouldn't have been enough motivation. Brandon had already done some jail time, and Brandon wasn't afraid to take the punishment that was dealt to him, he said. No, I don't believe that, not for a minute. It took a lot more than that to scare Brandon. Additionally, Brandon was actively making future career plans, Brad said. Brandon had a whole new job he was going to start that Monday with more money and more benefits. Okay, so the coincidence theorists brush off everything, but in any kind of case, something that is out of the ordinary really needs to be looked at. This is not just another average day. So he's in the process of cashing out his 401k and starting a new job that Monday when he goes missing. So is this work related in some capacity? People don't start a new job every single week. So this is an unusual week for Brandon Lawson in many ways. Lofton said she knows Brandon initiated the process of cashing in his 401k, but she doesn't know if he ever got the money. His last check was direct deposited into his account that Friday and was never withdrawn, eventually going to the state to cover child support for his eldest daughter, Lofton said. You know what's weird, though? They can't verify whether he got his 401k. I mean, what is this? I mean, this is a 2018 article. They can't verify whether he actually got the 401k. They can verify that his last check was direct deposited and he never withdrew it. Interesting. Brandon went up missing in the dead of night. How far could he have actually gone in that terrain, Brad asked. How far could a man have gone in a pair of shorts without any water or anything to drink? Beyond not being able to find Brandon's body, Kyle doesn't understand how all traces of his brother vanished. For a person to have a wallet, keys, and a full keychain, socks, shoes, shirt, a wallet full of cards and money and an ID and his cell phone, a cell phone case, all of that stuff, and not a single thing has been found out there. I just don't understand that, he said. My brother might have been a felon and might have messed with drugs, and he might have relapsed, Kyle said. But my brother worked for what he had. He loved his children. He took care of his children. He was a good person. He wasn't some dope fiend living on the streets, robbing people, or trying to get over on someone to get high again. And this seems to be corroborated. I mean, over 60 hours a week of work. Lofton believes someone knows something about what happened to Brandon, and if they could just come forward, they could make my life, my kid's life, so much better. Another point, too, he hadn't been home the previous night. So where was he the previous night and with whom? And he's starting a new job. He's cashing out his 401k. How often do these occurrences happen in someone's life? This is a strange culmination leading up to a disappearance, and any part or none of all of these factors might be a factor. We don't know, of course. But to just hallucinate that these are all coincidences and that it can definitely be known that they're a coincidence, that those are coincidences, I mean, that's silly nonsense, and that's why cases remain unsolved. She hasn't been able to find the identity of the dispatcher he spoke to that night, or who the trucker that called about the pickup was. Whoa, what the heck? So, what? So from 2013 to 2018, Lofton still, they don't know who the dispatcher was? What the heck? Okay, this is mind-shocking on so many levels. So obviously, doesn't law enforcement know who the dispatcher and who the trucker was? But 5 years later, Lofton still doesn't know, so this information hasn't been released? People should like to talk about what they think happened to Brandon. This is bizarre. I tell myself it was an accident, even though when you listen to the 911 call and you know it's not, she said. When it's your person in your life that you spend every day with, you don't want to think anyone would want to hurt him. I love Brandon so much. He was the true love of my life. You know when you feel like you can't live without somebody, that was it. Did Brandon Lawson succumb to the West Texas element? US 277 cuts through desolate, drought-prone terrain, spotted green with thorny mesquite, husach, and cactus. It's an environment largely inhabited by rattlesnakes and feral hogs. Texas Ranger Nick Hanna could not discuss Brandon's case because it's an active investigation. Even though supposedly they have nothing and zero evidence. But Lofton said Hanna told her he thinks Brandon's body is somewhere out there in that land. In an email, Hanna did provide information on the efforts to locate Brandon in Bronte with physical searches conducted on 4 occasions in August. One in September, one in October, another in January 2014, February 2014, and the last in July 2014. These searches included 2 DPS helicopters, ATVs, Texar, 6 cadaver dogs, 4 different agencies at one time or another. Hanna wrote, "It's a tough case. People always want to blame it on law enforcement that they didn't do a good job, but they only have so many resources." Since Brandon went missing, Hanna has received leads of possible sightings, all of which have been determined not to be Mr. Lawson, he wrote. So apparently they definitively ruled out a lot of these sightings, which you don't have in other cases, where in other cases some of the sightings are vague and they may or may not have been him. But Hanna is stating here, all of which have been determined to not be Mr. Lawson. Unless, of course, he's lying and covering something up, but why would he do that? Private investigator Paula Boudreau understands the family's frustration. "It's a tough case. People always want to blame it on law enforcement that they didn't do a good job," said Boudreau, the second private investigator Lofton has hired. But she said they have only so many resources, just like me. Well, they have a lot more resources than a private eye. Coming onto the case with fresh eyes, Lofton said Boudreau is tracking down leads when they come up, usually from the Help Find Brandon Lawson Facebook page, which has nearly 15,000 likes. You never know, a little something might become something, Lofton said about the tips. When it comes to searching the area, some landowners wouldn't allow Boudreaux or Brandon's family on their property. But Boudreaux said she has been told the rangers and sheriff have cleared that land. And of course, if there is a cover-up, if someone is associated with the sheriff or rangers, then they would, of course, have said the land was searched, even if it wasn't, if they do know something had happened on a particular piece of land. But again, we don't know whether that is true or untrue. In 4 separate searches using dogs, she was able to clear land west of US 277, south of Highway 158 to Humble Road, as well as the land east of US 277, south of Main Street to just west of Highway 285. For the private land within those quadrants where owners wouldn't allow her onto the property, her response was, "I'll just fly over your land and I'll have binoculars," she said, taking a helicopter trips over the area on 2 occasions. But Boudreaux said she hasn't been back to Bronte to clear more land for almost 2 years. "You do all that you can with what you know," she said. "Then at some point you just got to sit back and wait." Lofton is waiting to hear back from Texas EquiSearch, a nonprofit search and recovery team that uses horses to cover large areas. She plans to use drones to fly over the area as well. Finding Brandon, whatever the outcome, the Lawson family said would help. "It don't get any easier," Brad said about not knowing what happened to his son. "Each day you wonder if you're going to get that call. It's not every once in a while. All along, I've stated the fact that I would like to find Brandon and bring him home where he belongs," he continued. "The chances of us finding Brandon alive are almost none, and I understand that and I realize that, but he's not here. He deserves to be brought home to his family. For now, the red and white cross bearing Brandon's name that his grandfather made gives his family a place to visit every few months. I just want to find him to have closure on where he's at. Then we'll get to the point of what happened," Lofton said. "Finding him, no matter what, we would have somewhere to visit, not just that cross." So, very, very in-depth article here on Go San Angelo. Okay, I'm going to go over yet another article here. This is on medium.com featuring some details previously not gone over. This was posted February 17th, 2020 on the True Crime Files, medium.com. Murder, meth, or an innocent mishap, what happened to Brandon Lawson? Brandon Lawson had a lot to live for. He had been dedicated to his fiancée, Ladessa Lofton, for 10 years, and the couple had 3 children. Brandon also had a child from a previous relationship. By all accounts, Brandon was a loving and attentive father, but he had struggled with substance abuse issues in the past and had recently relapsed shortly before his disappearance in 2013. More than 6 years later, Brandon's family and those familiar with the case still wonder whether his drug issues played a role in his disappearance, and if so, what role? Into the darkness. The evening of August 9th, 2013 wasn't a very good one for Brandon Lawson. The 26-year-old San Angelo, Texas resident was an oil field worker who sometimes spent 13 hours on the job at a time. According to Ladessa, Brandon sometimes worked 95 hours a week. Wow. So this is an oil field worker working up to 95 hours a week? That's insane. So if he's a druggie, I mean, he's one of the most functional druggies ever. I mean, this guy, it's amazing. You have to be quite dedicated to your family to work 95 hours a week. The long hours precipitated a job change, and Brandon was to start his new job soon. Again, another interesting tidbit there that is a little unusual. When a very tired Brandon arrived home on August 9th, his exhaustion only grew worse when he began arguing with his fiancée. He was said to have been in panic mode. So was he upset about something else, and where was he the night before when he didn't come home? But Ladessa had a right to be angry. Her common in-law husband hadn't come home at all the previous night, and she was frustrated by his recent drug use. In a rage, Brandon left the family's home, intending to drive to his father's house in the town of Crowley, a 3.5-hour drive away. Worried about her fiancé's state of mind behind the wheel, Ladessa phoned Brandon and asked him not to go all the way to Crowley. It was already after midnight. Instead, Ladessa suggested he make the 5-mile trek to his brother's house to spend the night. Brandon switched gears and started driving north on Highway 277 towards Abilene, abandoning his journey towards his father's house along Highway 67. This doesn't necessarily mean he decided to heed Ledessa's advice, however. It's possible that Brandon chose an even longer route to his father's house. Brandon had a bench warrant, so it's possible he was still headed to his father's house, but opted to take the back roads to avoid police or to take a more scenic route. Scenic route at night? Of course, it would have made much sense to take the scenic route. Of course, it wouldn't have made much sense to take the scenic route in the middle of the night, but he wasn't in the best frame of mind at the time. Brandon's truck was almost out of gas, but he decided to try and make the 30-minute drive to Stripes convenience store and gas station. Meanwhile, back at Brandon and Ledessa's home, Ledessa phoned Brandon's brother, Kyle, out of concern for Brandon's well-being after their argument. Kyle offered to come with his girlfriend, Audrey, and visit Ledessa and the children, one of whom was sick at the time. Kyle arrived at the home around 12:10 a.m. About 45 minutes after Brandon took off in his truck, he too phoned Kyle, but not for a wellness check. He needed his brother to bring him gasoline as his truck had stopped running along Highway 277 near Bronte. It was hard to make out everything Brandon was saying because cell service was spotty in the area where his truck broke down. The last thing Brandon told his brother was, "I'm 10 minutes up the road, just hurry up and get here." At some point while he was on the phone with his brother, Brandon said, "3 expletives are chasing me out of town." The expletive referred to Mexicans, and when Brandon said this, Kyle immediately suspected that meth was contributing to his brother's state of mind and asked him if he was tripping, but Brandon assured him he was not. So just another quick aside here, if there was some kind of Mexican cartel involved here, there's a higher chance of that happening in Texas than, let's say, Minnesota. So these aren't necessarily the ramblings, the meth-induced ramblings of a psychotic man. Especially a guy with a warrant who has a history of drug use and or distribution in some capacity, or at least a warrant out for such. Kyle called Ledessa and told her to leave a gas can on the porch, which she did before taking a shower and going to bed. She also put her cell phone in her van to charge as her phone was running out of juice and she didn't have a working charger that she could use in the house. With her phone out of sight and out of mind, Ledessa missed several calls from both Kyle and Brandon. When she went to sleep that night, she expected that Brandon would be back in the morning. The plan to help Brandon was a lengthy one, not as simple as picking up the gas can and taking gasoline to the broken down truck. Kyle was still waiting for his latest paycheck to clear, so he would have to pick up the gas can, drive out to where Brandon was stranded, get money from him, go get gas, and then return to Brandon's truck. But when Kyle and Audrey arrived at the location, Brandon directed them to, he was nowhere to be found. Brandon's truck wasn't sitting alone alongside the road, however. A police car was parked next to it. It didn't appear that an accident had occurred, nor were there any signs of a struggle. A concerned motorist had seen the abandoned truck and the odd way in which it was parked and had phoned the police. Okay, so another point here, when Kyle and Audrey arrived, a police car was already there. So does that mean that this Deputy Neal, was involved in something? Were the gunshots heard? Did that have something to do with Deputy Neal? Now, here's the thing. He said state troopers, so that wouldn't be Deputy Neal. But what are the gunshots and what are these other individuals? That means there was another vehicle there at some point, and again, we have no evidence of that. So it's hard to figure this out. The frantic 911 call. When Kyle and Audrey arrived at the mile marker where Brandon told him they would be, Deputy Neal from the Coke County Sheriff's Office explained that he had been dispatched to the spot after a passing motorist had called 911. And we'll be getting to the point that apparently no police were sent based on Brandon's 911 call. So the only reason, according to his story, Deputy Neal, again, if we don't have any evidence from the dispatcher, they still can't figure out who the police dispatcher was in this small town. Well, what is going on? Shortly after Brandon hung up with his brother the last time, a terrified and frantic Brandon also called 911. The dispatcher had a difficult time deciphering a great deal of what Brandon was saying, but they were able to make out the following. Yes, I'm in the middle of a field, inaudible, pushed some guys over right here going towards Abilene on both sides. My truck ran out of gas, there's one guy here, the guy's chasing, inaudible, to the woods, please hurry. Is it possible he picked someone up, that Brandon Lawson had someone else in his truck at some point before whatever happened at that location? I don't know. It's kind of weird. Was he making some kind of drug deal? And it went wrong. And maybe or maybe not there's officers involved. He also told the dispatcher, we're not talking to him, inaudible. I told you I ran into him. That's the first guy. When the dispatcher asked Brandon if he needed an ambulance, he replied, no, I need the cops. After that, the connection went dead. And of course, when we listen to it, you can hear a second person saying, protect yourself or something of the like, and things that could be gunshots. Okay, it would be 3 days before anyone realized that Brandon had phoned 911, as no one was dispatched to his location after that. LaDessa only discovered the exchange while scrolling through Brandon's phone records. It's likely the dispatcher dismissed Brandon's pleas for help when the call was dropped. Okay, all right, now here's where we're going into Mindshock land. So there's a missing guy. Nobody even knows that he phoned 911. No police were ever dispatched to his location as a result of the 911 call. And the 911 dispatcher to this day remains unidentified. Does this sound normal to anybody? Anybody? Bueller? It's kind of weird. Many recordings of the 911 call have made the rounds online, some slowed down or enhanced in an effort to learn more. It's clear from these recordings that Brandon was desperate and out of breath. His thick southern drawl sometimes make it difficult to determine what he's saying. It's possible that his intoxicated state contributed to the garbled nature of the call. Kyle and Audrey noticed that Brandon appeared to have abandoned his truck in haste. The back end was sticking out on the road, its doors unlocked. The passing motorist had called the police because he believed the protruding truck was a hazard to other drivers. Brandon's keys, wallet, and cell phone were missing. Somewhere in the midst of the chaos and confusion that night, Brandon managed to call Audrey to tell her that he was bleeding, but once again it was impossible to glean any more details from the call because of the poor connection. Despite numerous searches of thousands of acres of land, including the use of cadaver dogs, infrared cameras, and airplanes to search from above, no one has seen or heard from Brandon since that fateful night. Another point here. Is it possible that Brandon Lawson is driving along and he stumbles upon some kind of situation? Maybe an arrest gone wrong with state troopers, maybe corrupt state troopers involved in some kind of a drug deal, and he stops the vehicle and runs off because maybe they already have their guns out? Or if there's no one else in the road, he's pulling up to them. Did they block off the road for something, for some reason? And then they saw him. Was it someone looking for a victim? Was it some kind of cartel situation? Or was it some kind of gang members or criminals out to have some fun and they blocked off the road in some capacity? Or individuals impersonating state troopers? And they blocked the road in some way which forced him... But if his truck is out of gas, though, if there's zero gas in the truck, is it possible at the moment his gas is running out, this is all going down? Again, this seems to be an outlier case. So no one is arguing that in the majority of all these missing persons cases that all of these factors converge and cause the situation. Is this one of those rare cases that this happened to happen? Let's not fall for black and white logical fallacies. More than one thing could be true. And again, I'm not asserting, for the Dunning-Kruger crowd out there that keep commenting on Mindshock videos, I'm not asserting that this is a likely possibility or that all of these possibilities are equal likelihood. For whatever reason, the cognitive dissonant coincidence out there, they get really triggered and they hallucinate then I'm saying that all of these scenarios are equally possible. Just pretty hilarious. Theories: since Brandon's 911 call was of such poor quality, it's frustrating trying to figure out what he was saying and what, if anything, was happening to him in those moments. Yet the theories of what happened to him depend largely on that call because, frankly, that's all we have to go on. Thanks to the Crawl Space podcast, which interviewed Kyle Lawson, we now have a lot more details than we did when Brandon first went missing. Theory 1, he was murdered. A hastily abandoned vehicle, a 911 call placed by a panic-stricken man, and a disappearance spanning 6.5 years. Yup, it definitely sounds like murder. You know what they say, though, never judge a book by its cover. The theory that Brandon was murdered is supported by the following facts. Brandon indicated in the call that he was not alone. He pushed some guys over on both sides. This obviously suggests that he was in the presence of more than one person. He goes on to say in the call that one person was chasing him and another one was doing something in the field, running towards it perhaps. We may never know. And it does sound like someone is saying protect yourself in the background. Based on the 911 call, Brandon ran into these people, though it's not clear exactly what that means. Some have suggested that he physically ran into another vehicle or hit an actual person, but there was nothing found at the scene to suggest either scenario had occurred. Yet run into means encounter. It doesn't necessarily mean physically crashed into. He requested the police. He claimed he was bleeding. He mentioned to his brother Kyle that the Mexicans in the neighborhood were after him. However, no one knew who he was referring to, and his truck broke down in a desolate area, not a neighborhood. During an interview with Kyle on the Crawl Space podcast, Kyle said Brandon told him that Ledessa got the aforementioned Mexicans from the neighborhood to chase him out of town. 2 were still chasing him, but a third one had been pulled over by a state trooper. So this is what Kyle said on the Crawl Space podcast. Okay, so here's the thing, though. They got into this really bad fight. Is it possible that Ledessa got some people, possibly not even Mexicans, but again, if Brandon Lawson is in some kind of drug-induced state, or just mistaken, he might have thought they were. Who knows? But either way, that doesn't mean people weren't chasing him out of town. I mean, it's very curious. It's very curious, although I would assume that the single-digit law enforcement department would have at least talked to the neighbors to see if anything strange had happened that night or the night before, and has anyone ever nailed down where Brandon was the night before? Also, another thing to keep in mind, this guy's working incredibly long hours. So whether he's also on drugs or not, if this incredibly exhausted individual also becomes embroiled in some kind of running shootout or high-stress situation after not sleeping much for an hour period of time, he's going to be out of it even if he's not on drugs, to a certain extent. So I found another interesting tidbit on morbidology.com, the bizarre disappearance of Brandon Lawson, where it states he also called Kyle's girlfriend Audrey. She was the last person to ever speak to Brandon that night. In that phone call, he pleaded, Audrey, I'm bleeding, before the call was cut off. So this is something, this was in the San Angelo Standard Times, September 28th, 2013. Family police search for a man. And this tidbit I haven't heard. Apparently she was the last one that has a conversation with her, and he's saying, I'm bleeding. Audrey, I'm bleeding. And that is, of course, ominous. If Brandon had been murdered, investigators surely would have found blood at the scene, which they did not. It's possible that Brandon was taken by someone and murdered elsewhere, but that doesn't change the fact that Brandon said he was bleeding, but no blood was ever found. Not on the road, not in the field, not in or on his truck. Let me put it this way, if blood was found, the information was never made public. Is it possible, like, he wasn't bleeding severely? So, like, let's say he has a cut on his forehead and it's just running down his face to his shirt and his shirt is absorbing everything. And somehow, even if there were drops of blood here or there, they just weren't uncovered because there wasn't a ton of blood. Is that possible? I don't know. Continuing on here with the Medium article. Now, about the second voice on the 911 call, I've listened to the call, and it does indeed sound like someone was with Brandon when he placed the call. But again, the call was of such poor quality that it's hard to say for certain whether it was a noise or just whether it was a voice or just background noise. It could have been the voice of someone who stopped to help Brandon, but if the person was just a good Samaritan, why hasn't he come forward to be identified and interviewed by the police? That's a good point. It clearly sounds like there's someone else there saying either protect yourself or something like that. Something that sounds like protect yourself. But it clearly sounds like a voice. It does not sound like a car. Did he owe money? Okay, at the time of his disappearance, Brandon was once again involved in drugs. His family states this as fact. He also had an outstanding felony warrant for delivering drugs, so we can say with relative ease that he was involved with some unsavory people. Did he owe money? Was he a narc? There may very well have been a motive for killing Brandon Lawson. And another point, we don't know what's relevant or not. He's leaving one job and starting another job. So is it possible it's job related? Is it possible other people at his work were also involved in drugs? All right, next theory, he ran away. Brandon had a couple of solid reasons to run away. First, there was his felony warrant, which carried a sentence of 2 to 20 years in prison. However, he was out on bond, so he was likely looking at more probation, time served, or a very short sentence. But if he was back on drugs and tested positive for a substance, drug screenings are always a condition for parole when drug charges are involved. That could have derailed his chances of merely extending his probation and may have placed him behind bars. Also, was there a scheduled drug test to start his next job? So is it possible that Brandon faked his own death abduction to escape his legal problems? Absolutely. Brandon's family has stated, however, that Brandon had already done time in state prison and was not fearful of having to go back. The thing is, his family said he was dealing with a felony charge and had an attorney. He was not trying to get out of it, he was facing it head on. Also, he would have been abandoning his fiancée and 4 children, which no one associated with Brandon believes he would have had the heart to do. If he disappeared of his own accord, it seems odd that he would take his keys, wallet, and cell phone with him. After 3 a.m. on the morning of his disappearance, neither his phone nor his credit card, debit cards were ever used again. His keys were rendered useless when his truck was finally towed. It appears that none of the missing items from his truck served him any purpose, and if he was trying to fake his own murder or abduction, it would have made much more sense to leave those things behind. On the other hand, maybe he just always kept those things on him at all times, and their absence has little to do with what happened to him. I also think it's interesting that a man who was supposedly on the run from law enforcement called 911 asking for the police. Those were the very people he would have avoided. Since there have been no signs that Brandon Lawson started a new life, the logical conclusion, if you believe he was on the run, is that he hid out somewhere and died there. Unfortunately, because of the nature of meth, very few of the details of this case make sense. Drugs. Brandon's brother Kyle has mentioned on numerous podcasts that his brother was a meth user who was high at the time of his disappearance. According to Kyle, Brandon's argument with Ledessa was about drugs. It seems that Brandon had tried to score some meth earlier in the day and was trying to talk his brother into helping him get some. Kyle also mentioned that Brandon had done meth on the night of his disappearance. Now, did he know that with 100% certainty, or did he assume that? Are we going to put blind faith in Kyle and assume he can't be mistaken under any circumstances, no matter what? Now, also, if Kyle is telling the truth, whom did they try to score meth from? That seems like it would be a very, very good question and would need to be investigated. And did he actually score the meth? And was there some kind of a situation or argument from the individuals he scored the meth from, or tried to if he didn't? Again, we cannot ignore these possibilities. It's very possible the people he was associated with, for whatever reason, might have wanted to harm him. When Kyle was summoned to Brandon and Ledessa's home after the couple argued, Ledessa told him that Brandon was flipping out and tripping. I've written about my experiences with meth addicts in the past on this blog. They can become highly paranoid and experience psychosis. Their decision-making skills are shot, so getting behind the wheel of, I'm not sure if that's the best word, so getting behind the wheel of a truck and making a confusing 911 call while high isn't as crazy as it might sound. But what about people in the background of the call saying protect yourself and possible gunshots? What about that? If it's true that Brandon was on meth when he ran out of gas, he could have been seeing people and things that weren't there. Although those things probably wouldn't be, how could they be recorded on a 911 call if they're not real, though? He could have been paranoid in general that he was being followed, which again, whether he was or he wasn't, that doesn't mean he wasn't being followed. Paranoid people can also be followed too, particularly if they're involved with unsavory individuals in the drug trade. In other words, Brandon may not have been making anything up at all. He fully believed he was being followed by Mexicans. He fully believed he was in a field flanked by people who wanted to do him harm. Maybe he was bleeding, but it wasn't because anyone attacked him. In his fearful, paranoid state, it's possible that Brandon wandered off somewhere to hide and succumbed to the elements or to a drug overdose. I mean, you'd have to believe that all the searchers, the helicopter, all of that, they were completely incompetent in that case. He could have fallen in the water. He was near the Colorado River and a bridge and drowned for all we know. Again, highly unlikely, because if that did happen, the river was extremely shallow, so his body would be very easy to find if that happened. Or Brandon was involved in a drug deal gone bad while he was high. But again, where is the evidence of a crime and where is the body? All good questions, but I can't ignore the curiosities in the phone call and the things that don't add up. Particularly, no police were even dispatched, and they can't identify the dispatcher or the truck driver who called 911. I mean, those are curiosities. You just can't, unless you're just a really hardcore coincidence theorist, you're going to want to actually investigate that if you're after the truth. Other points of interest, let's refer back to the Crawl Space podcast for a moment, since Kyle revealed some other notable facts on the show. Kyle states that when he and his girlfriend arrived at the arranged meetup spot, they saw Brandon's truck, but not Brandon, and asked him over the phone where he was. Brandon told them he was right there, but they didn't see him. Could Brandon have gotten lost? Was he in a drug-induced psychosis? Was he injured nearby, face down in the dirt, and they literally couldn't see him? Was this a ruse to fake his own death disappearance? During the call, a police vehicle approached Kyle, which caused Brandon to shout out over the phone, "One time, run." Kyle responded by telling him he hadn't done anything wrong and wasn't going to run, to which Brandon replied, "Where is your pride, mother expletive?" He then hung up on Kyle. Kyle is absolutely certain that his brother was able to see him from his vantage point because he was able to warn him that a police vehicle was approaching. Okay, wait a second. So was the vehicle there when they came there or not? Because in these accounts, there's conflicting accounts of whether or not there's a police vehicle already there responding to the truck driver's call. Here it's stating that he was warning him that a police vehicle was approaching. Or was that a second police vehicle? A lot of this is unclear. I don't know why there's so many conflicting reports here. The field in question is actually teeming with trees and brush, so it would have been relatively easy for Brandon to find a hiding spot. Kyle said he has no idea why Brandon would have instructed him to run from the cops, since Brandon is the one who called 911 in the first place. Again, if there's something weird going on with police officers, either corrupt police officers or people impersonating police officers, Brandon might be differentiating between officers. Kyle asked the cop to go down the road and look for his brother because of the shoddy cell phone service. The cop informed him that he would do so, but he had just come from that direction and there was no sign of Brandon. After Brandon disappeared, Kyle was heavily scrutinized by the police, but he passed 2 polygraph tests. He stated that he believes the police officer he spoke to that night should be subjected to a polygraph as well. And we can all agree with that. But brain fingerprint scan more so. Now, let's assume for a minute that the police were involved in Brandon's disappearance. They could have easily told everyone that no blood or signs of a struggle were found and that they never saw Brandon along the side of the road or field. Though Kyle doesn't come out and say it, one possibility is that Brandon stumbled across police officers doing something illegal, and they had to do away with Brandon to protect themselves. Another point here, if Brandon picked somebody up, either some kind of drug dealer, user, whatever, and they were together in the truck when they encountered some kind of corrupt police officers, and then they were running, and then his buddy is saying, protect yourself. because the police officers are shooting at them or chasing them down, or not police officers, or another group of people possibly associated with police officers that would cover for them for whatever reason. Also, Kyle doesn't believe LaDessa had anyone run Brandon out of town, but it does put a new spin on the case. According to Redditors, Kyle told reporters that Brandon thought that Mexicans were chasing him about 8 months before he went missing. Maybe LaDessa was sick of dealing with a drug addict. Admittedly, it is a very sad, very frustrating, very infuriating situation to deal with. The lies get old fast, especially when there are children involved. Do I believe that LaDessa actually got Mexicans to run her fiancé out of town? Nope, but it's still a theory. So let's examine this 8 months prior incident. And this is from a subreddit. Actually, let me finish this article first, and then we will go into this development with these so-called Mexicans 8 months prior. Scraper, staper, sniper. As I mentioned, Kyle believes the state trooper he encountered that night should submit to a polygraph test. This begs the question, were the cops involved in Brandon's demise? During the 911 call, Brandon refers to something that sounds like scraper or staper in between telling the dispatcher, I'm in the middle of a field, and my truck broke down. Some have suggested he may have been saying sniper, or he was trying to say state trooper and garbled his words. Kyle believes Brandon was saying state trooper. And whether this was a garbling or an intentional editing on the part of the 911 tape, we don't know. In conclusion, in the more than 6 years since Brandon Lawson went missing, family and friends have never given up on finding the young man who had so much promise, yet was still in the merciless grip of drugs. Still, much has changed over the years. Most notably, LaDessa Lofton got married in May 2019. I'm so sad that the father of her children is still out there somewhere and she's received no closure. Good for her for moving on with her life. Things can't stay in a suspended state forever. In my unprofessional opinion, Brandon was on drugs the night he disappeared. He was hallucinating and paranoid. He wandered off somewhere and either succumbed to the elements, drowned, or was fatally injured. I don't think he is still alive. He just hasn't been found yet. The story is so creepy and unnerving, though, that the possibility he was murdered will always lurk in the dark recesses of my mind until the truth finally emerges. Many people have a harsh opinion of drug users. Unless you're dealt with the substance yourself, it's hard to understand why anyone would risk everything to get high. I get it, believe me, I do. It's hard for me to understand the draw of a drug as destructive as methamphetamine. The truth is that people use drugs to cope with pain. Wherever Brandon Lawson is right now, I hope he has found healing and freedom from his demons. May the future be good to LaDessa as well as Brandon's children. And again, this is yet another individual for some reason falling for this logical fallacy, this false dichotomy. Even if he was hallucinating, paranoid, and on drugs, how does that magically eliminate him from being able to be involved in a situation where he either stumbled upon something or was actively drawn into something by other parties? It just doesn't make any logical sense how all these so-called true crime aficionados just fall for this logical fallacy. Okay, so let's move on to the subreddit Unresolved Mysteries, where there's an interesting post here by Meat and Tits. Massive update on Brandon Lawson case. I'll update this post as soon as I can find anything more on it, just to make sure it's legitimate information. I was just listening to the Crawlspace podcast, and they played a statement from Brandon's brothers Kyle on the show, followed by an interview with him. Apparently, Kyle just got out of jail and prison on a drug charge, and he reached out to communicate what he knows. Here are the major points so far with new information in bold. So Kyle, like all these, like LaDessa and these other individuals involved in this case, giving their statements, are they all neutral, objective parties? Here's the thing, they're not. They're not. There's the old saying, of course, trust but verify. On Mindshock, I say distrust and verify. If we're being logical and scientific, there's no reason to put blind faith in anybody's words. Yeah, maybe what they're saying is true. Maybe it's not. The case is still unsolved. Now, that doesn't mean they're intentionally lying. They might be saying things that they believe to be true, but they're actually not true. Or they could be lying and deceptive for a host of reasons. Not because they don't want to find the truth about Brandon, but maybe because they don't want something else uncovered that they think has nothing to do with Brandon Lawson, but maybe it does. Maybe there's other individuals on the periphery who are involved in shady dealings with them, and they were responsible for what happened to Brandon Lawson, but Kyle or Ledessa, that for some reason they think they weren't. They truly believe they weren't, and they won't disclose these other bits of info. Just going through possible theories. I'm not saying that's true or likely in any way. I'm saying it's unknown. Okay, so here are the major points so far with new information in bold. Brandon's fight with Ledessa seems to have been about drugs, as Brandon was trying to get drugs earlier that day, and he asked Kyle to get some for him or help him get some. I think the drug he's referring to is meth, because later in the podcast he mentions that Brandon occasionally did meth, and he did it on the night of his disappearance. So did Kyle actually find some meth and get it to him? And were there unsavory individuals involved in the procurement of the meth that led to something? Now, again, this guy went missing this particular night, and if Kyle somehow knows more about these individuals but is afraid to say, does he know that these individuals might possibly be involved with corrupt law enforcement as well, and that's why this case hasn't been solved? Okay, either way, Brandon and Ledessa have a major argument, and he calls his brother at some point to tell him to make sure Ledessa doesn't touch any of his things while he wasn't home. Kyle told him she hadn't touched anything, and then he gave the phone to Ledessa and Brandon, and Ledessa continued arguing. Brandon's brother Kyle returns home and showers, changes clothes, but then Kyle gets a call from his mother to go back to Brandon and Ledessa's house to calm Brandon down because he was flipping out. When Kyle gets to their house, Brandon is already gone, and so he asks Ledessa what happened. She claims Brandon was tripping and flipping out. Kyle then gets a call from Brandon, and Brandon tells Kyle that Ledessa got some Mexicans from the neighborhood to chase Brandon out of town, and there are two of them still chasing him, but a state trooper pulled over the third one. Bizarre. And like I said, there seems to be another missing piece. Did Brandon also happen to pick somebody up, either a dealer, fellow drug user, whatever, and that's the person saying protect yourself? Or if we're going down every single possible theory, is it possible that these individuals went to chase Brandon Lawson out of town, but the state troopers got on their tail and they're shooting at them, and now these so-called Mexicans, whether they're Mexicans or not, now they're basically common allies with Brandon Lawson at that moment if the state troopers are coming after all of them, in which case they're saying to Brandon, protect yourself. Or it's whoever Brandon, if Brandon picked somebody up and had somebody there with him who's his friend in the moment, is saying protect yourself from the Mexicans, and are there also state troopers following them? Again, it's hard to make heads or tails with all of this information. Brandon hangs up with Kyle, calls him back a few minutes later to tell him that he ran out of gas, asks Kyle to bring him some gas. Kyle lets him know he'll have to stop back at their house to get the gas cans. Brandon calls back several times but cannot be understood except for the call where he tells Kyle and Kyle's partner to hurry and that he's bleeding. Kyle and his girlfriend arrive to where Brandon told them to meet, and they see Brandon's truck and ask him where he is, but he claims he's right there, though they cannot see him. A vehicle approaches, and Brandon says to Kyle one more time, run. I'm 99% sure that the term one time is used to refer to cops. Kyle confirms this later in the conversation. So yeah, there's a conflicting information on whether or not the officer was there when Kyle got there or not. That definitely needs to be cleared up. Kyle tells him he's done nothing wrong, he's not going to run. Brandon says to him, where's your pride, mother expletive, and then he hangs up on Kyle. Kyle approaches the officer and asks if he can search down the road for Brandon because he keeps losing signal and he can't find him. The officer says it's okay, but tells him he's not in the direction Kyle is going because the cop just came from there and didn't see him. It's at this point that Kyle learns that Brandon called 911 in between the time that he called Kyle to ask for gas and the where's your pride call in which Brandon tells Kyle to run. Kyle states that he does not know why Brandon would say that, considering Brandon himself called the cops. After searching up and down the road, Kyle's son was hungry. I guess his son was in the car with him, so Kyle goes to his bank to withdraw some money and get some food for his son and to fill up a gas can with 5 gallons of gas. Kyle then picks up a friend to help him look for Brandon, and they return to Brandon's truck and fill it up with gas. Kyle yells, "There's no cops anymore, and we filled your car with gas. You can come out now." They go up and down the road yelling for him, but they cannot find him, and so they eventually go back home. At 9 a.m., LaDessa files a missing persons report. So according to this statement, she filed the missing persons report that day at 9 a.m. There's a lot of conflicting information in this case. It does not pass the sniff test on the part of law enforcement. Here's the thing, though. Okay, is the reason the dispatcher is never identified because the dispatcher, he gets the call from Lawson, he calls a trooper or officer in the area, they inform him that they're already on top of the situation, if they're involved in the situation. And that's why this happened the way that it happened, and there's so much confusion. At the end of the statement, the conversation starts, some interesting notes. When asked about drugs, Kyle's brother states, "I don't believe he was on meth, I know he was." So does that mean he went with Brandon and got him the meth and saw him use it? Kyle states that he himself has used meth but has never hallucinated because of it. He also says that Brandon had OD'd before, and that while meth would cause him to act differently, he has never acted like he did on the night of the disappearance. Okay, so we're talking about somebody who's been in the presence of Brandon Lawson when on drugs or on meth, and that this particular night was completely different. So he still believes he was on drugs, but apparently something else was also going on. Again, perfectly logical. Kyle says, "I don't believe LaDessa had anybody chasing Brandon out of town." Kyle says that it sounded as if Brandon was initially running, but later it sounds as if he's standing completely still. Brandon tells Kyle that he could see Kyle and the cop, though Kyle says that he could not see Brandon anywhere. In explaining how he knows 100% that Brandon was in the area, he says that noises that sounded like gunshots in the call were actually sounds of a vehicle going over the bridge over the Colorado River nearby. So there's multiple gunshots, and again, according to the deputy, the place is desolate. How many cars are going over the bridge at 1 a.m. in rapid succession? I don't know. People from the area, feel free to chime in. Kyle says that though the police doubted him, he passed 2 polygraph exams. Kyle suggested that the police officer he spoke to that night should be subjected to a polygraph test. And shouldn't that be standard? All responding officers should it should be part of protocol for them to take a brain fingerprint scan or at least a polygraph. I mean, it's called accountability. I mean, isn't that just like having a body cam on them? It's for their protection, so people don't start thinking they're responsible for crimes. It's just they're a public servant. They're subject to scrutiny. They're not a private citizen. They're not entitled to privacy. They're in the middle of doing a public job paid for by the public. There needs to be accountability there. Okay, continuing on here, drug-induced psychosis seems like a real possibility now. And again, whether it is or it isn't, that doesn't mean that Brandon Lawson couldn't have been involved in some kind of situation. Apologize for this unorganized mess. This post is very incomplete and jumbled up right now, but here is a link to the Crawl Space podcast. I need sleep, but I was too excited since this case has been so mysterious up until now. Hearing Brandon's brother, Kyle, speak, I cannot say for sure whether or not he was reliable, but what he is saying does quite fit with the details available right now. Out of everything I've heard so far, I am slightly doubtful that LaDessa actually had Mexicans chase Brandon out of the city. Kyle does not believe that LaDessa had anything to do with it, since that seems like something right out of a movie plot. But if it is not true, it'd be important to know whether Brandon made it up or believed it in confused, drug-induced state, or whether Kyle made it up. Edit, though I was staunchly in the foul play camp, after listening to the podcast in its entirety, I am much, much more inclined to believe that his death was due to drug-induced psychosis. And here we have, yet again, another individual who doesn't understand logical fallacies. Just because someone is in a drug-induced psychosis, it doesn't make them magically protected by all the nefarious people out in the world, specifically if they routinely interact with these nefarious or shady individuals dealing drugs or involved in these criminal elements. It doesn't, drug-induced psychosis does not offer magical immunity from all foul play in the universe. I don't know why people just are so silly they don't understand that. But continuing on here, some observations. Thinking back on it now, after reading some replies, I too find it strange that this version of the story took so long to become public. I know Kyle was incarcerated, but that wouldn't prevent him from speaking to people about the case. Even if Kyle just couldn't reach out to anyone while locked up, why didn't Ledessa say anything? Maybe it was to keep Brandon's image clean. She was worried that the kids would one day think what the kids would one day think. It seems a little odd to me that it took so long. I'm curious to know if the cops knew all these details too. Why did Brandon suddenly stop talking to the 911 operator? Even assuming he was in a psychotic state, there is no big commotion heard over the phone when Brandon stops talking. Only those gunshot noises, which we now know are possibly the noises of a car going over the bridge. So could Brandon hear the call fine, but was just deciding to remain quiet? Or if he's being chased by gun-toting maniacs and they're closing in on him, he might not want to speak to give away his location. I don't know. Edit. So it seems that Kyle did tell reporters that Brandon thought Mexicans were chasing him about 8 months ago, and Endless Strains points out that a poster claiming to be Ledessa also said Mexicans were chasing him. Here's a link to the post 8 months ago. If Brandon was indeed hiding out so close nearby that he could see Kyle, how far could he have possibly traveled from that time? I think a new search should be done with a specific focus on the river. See, the thing I keep coming back to is the other voice on the phone call saying, protect yourself.
Ah, you ran into him. Okay.
Got the first guy.
Ah, you ran into him. Okay.
Got the first guy. Got the first guy. Got the first guy.
I mean, that's for me, that's a sticking point. I don't know what to make of that. The gunshots might not be gunshots, sure, but what protect yourself, then gunshots, and constant references to bleeding? What does that all mean? Then you add in all these coincidences and anomalies with the dispatcher not being identified, the truck driver calling 911 not being identified, the officer on scene, inconsistent stories on when the officer actually was on scene, the fact that nobody was even dispatched to help Brandon Lawson, who's making a phone call talking about bleeding and needing police, and then the dispatcher just doesn't say anything, or does he? And does he inform officers in the area who already know what's going on because they're involved in it? Yeah, this is a tough one. This is a really, really tough case. So a couple of issues here. There seem to be more issues with the sheriff. So apparently the sheriff wouldn't allow searches on private property even though the owners gave permission of a certain property. That makes it look kind of shady. So apparently Brandon's family got permission from property owners to search a property, and the sheriff blocked them from doing so. Now, if that's true, I mean, that's really, really damning. Because they have permission and the sheriff prevented them from searching a property even with permission. I don't know exactly what got lost in translation there, or maybe the sheriff didn't want an official law enforcement search. As if he knew something was on the property. I don't know, that's really bizarre. The other thing is, of course, we don't really know what those last conversations were like or what was really discussed. Some people also even theorize this was some kind of setup for Kyle. So was Brandon Lawson being forced to call? Was someone there forcing him to call his brother to get him to come there? Or something, and then were they planning to do something to Kyle, but then they couldn't because the other officer was there? This is if Brandon is not alone. And if this is all true, where are the other vehicles involved? Unless Brandon picked up more than one person, is it possible Brandon picked up two people after leaving his and Ledessa's house? Did he pick up one individual or more than one individual? Were they trying to get him to get Kyle there for some reason? It's all very, very bizarre. So I'll be doing a follow-up episode with some experts who've taken apart the audio even further, and cleaned it up even further. And theory is, of course, that the 911 call that has been released is not the entirety of the call. And there's some smoking gun evidence that was deleted from the call, and more evidence that the call has been manipulated in some capacity. So, yeah, very, very mysterious case. You can definitely see why it's captivated a lot of individuals online and has received a lot of attention, and why it's been one of the most requested cases on Mindshock. So, we have gone down these rabbit holes, and we have begun investigating the Brandon Lawson case, and there's plenty more to go over in the case. And just these critical questions that have not been answered and swept under the rug that you don't see in other cases. We have to use controls here. In other cases, you don't have these ghost dispatchers and ghost callers and manipulated phone calls and voices clearly heard on the phone call, and then still pretend the individual was alone, no matter what. And anybody questioning that is a crazy conspiracy theorist, aka critical thinker. Just really, really bizarre case. So feel free to leave your thoughts, theories, suggestions, rebuttals, debunkings of any kind in the comment section. If you enjoy the podcast, you can donate to our PayPal and help support the channel for us to release even more mind-shocking episodes and examinations in a multitude of true crime cases and series that we already cover. Just check the link in the description. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit the bell for notifications. You could also just go to youtube.com/Mindshock or youtube.com/MindShockTrueCrime. Like and share the podcast on social media platforms, of which you can find us on Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, and Patreon. Patrons do get priority for case topic, logical analysis, co-podcast, or requests. You can also be a guest on the podcast depending on your tier. This is Bruce McGuire signing off. Catch you guys next time.